Welcome to episode 32 of the Biodynamics Now Investigative Farming and Restorative Nutrition podcast. Your host is Alan Ballier. Our guest today is Dmitry Orlov, author of Shrinking the Technosphere, Getting a Grip on Technologies that Limit Our Autonomy, Self-Sufficiency, and Freedom. Shrinking the Technosphere is both a critique of the negative effects of technology on life on Earth and is a guide to walk readers through the process of bringing technology down to a manageable number of carefully chosen, controllable elements. It is about regaining the freedom to use technology for our own benefit and is recommended reading for all who seek to get back to a point where technologies assist us rather than control us. The show notes for today's conversation are at bdnow.org. If you appreciate hearing programs on topics as important as this one, please take the time to leave the Biodynamics Now podcast a positive review on iTunes. There's a link at the show notes at bdnow.org.
Our guest today is Dmitry Orlov, author of the wonderful book, Shrinking the Technosphere, a book I highly recommend that everybody buy and read as soon as possible for their own benefit. It not only shows what's happening to us in our relationship with technology, it also provides scenarios and strategies for freeing ourselves from its grip. How you doing, Dmitry?
Oh, really well. Good to be with you, Alan.
Good. Would you mind introducing your book?
Oh, yes. It's called Shrinking the Technosphere, and it's basically based on a very, very simple idea that some people have expressed to one extent or another, but none of them have really crystallized it, I think, the way I have, which is basically that what we're facing in the form of modern technology is a very flawed but sentient entity endowed with machine-like intelligence that tells us what to do. So the idea that we're masters of our own destiny is just born of a misplaced sense of agency, with the idea that we can decide which technologies to use is no longer valid. Basically, technology is something that is thrust upon us willy-nilly. And the other thing that is a very important realization is that the technosphere, as this machine-like sentient entity, serves its own purposes. We are its servants. It is not our servant. It will do whatever it wants with us. It has no sense of morality or good and evil at all. It just basically has a sense of functional adequacy and efficiency, which it interprets very narrowly in terms of its own self-interest. So humans are just basically entirely optional as far as their participation in this technical experiment is concerned. And the book is basically about that and about how we can push back, what effective methods we can use. And the book describes one particular method in great detail called harm-benefit analysis, which, if used, allows people to ratchet down their dependence on the technosphere, one technology decision at a time. And I hope that it proves to be a very effective method.
Okay, I think you lost me on the first sentence with, how is the technosphere a sentient being?
Well, basically, it is a sort of intelligence. It's an emergent intelligence, similarly to how Gaia is described, characterized by James Lovelock as a sentient entity, an emergent intelligence that regulates the homeostatic equilibrium of planet Earth in such a way that it can support the maximum diversity of life. It controls the composition of the atmosphere. It controls temperature. It controls ocean salinity. It controls various other factors that contribute to making Earth a living planet. In the same way, the technosphere controls a number of different parameters, such as endless growth. It is very good at producing that effect. It eats through non-renewable natural resources at a very efficient and ever-accelerating rate. And it exercises ever greater control over the biosphere, humans included. So those are all its prerogatives, and it is very effective in making sure that those prerogatives are followed.
And so is it outside of what we call market forces?
Market forces are a device that the Technosphere uses alongside with central control and central planning. It is a question of what is most efficient for a given society or a given set of conditions.
Okay. But so the circle of thinkers that I'm most involved with are, conspiracy advocates who feel that there's a group of men behind all the troubles we're having in the world. That's a really simplistic approach. But your thesis would be that those guys are working within the Technosphere.
Well, basically, if there is a set of quote-unquote conspirators, and I think the term conspiracy theory is basically a cop-out. But suppose, I'm not saying that there is.
Of course.
I have no information on that, but suppose there is some nefarious group of characters who are masters of the universe. Well, for them as well as for everyone else, if they think that they're in charge, that is the same misplaced sense of agency that everybody else has. They're not in charge, the Technosphere is. They do not determine what the Technosphere is going to do. If they try to not follow the prerogatives of the Technosphere, they're basically going to get knocked out.
Okay. Then let me step out of this conversation for a moment and ask you, as a former Russian citizen, I assume you're an American citizen now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's irrelevant, but as a former Russian citizen, how you feel about the current events in the United States?
Well, I don't know that there's a particular Russian perspective on it. I've lived in the United States for over 40 years, and I remain just entirely unconvinced that my participation in American politics is anything other than a waste of time.
I can see that. I guess since you've written at least 2 books on collapse, I just wondered how you feel about the administration that we're moving into.
Oh, well, basically, it's going to be blamed for whatever happens. That is certain. I think Trump runs a really good chance of becoming Herbert Hoover 2.0. Mm-hmm. A lot of things are lining up. He's walking into a gigantic market bubble that's going to pop. He's talking protectionism just like Herbert Hoover was talking protectionism. He's talking infrastructure investment just like Herbert Hoover. So all of those things are really, aligning. And he may end up sort of going down in flames because the country is going down in flames all around him, not because of anything he does.
Okay. And seems like a collapse of a democratic government too at the same time.
Well, that's a good thing because the democratic government that was in place before was sort of shambling towards World War III and nuclear confrontation with Russia, and Trump seems a lot less eager to pursue that goal. So he's the sane person, as opposed to Hillary Clinton, who is an insane person, and so I'm entirely in favor of that shift because I don't want to die.
Okay. Well, that's quite reasonable. Have you ever read the Eye of the Cyclone?
No.
Okay. So, you want to talk about some of these technologies that are particularly hazardous?
Well, yes. In terms of the harm-benefit analysis, a certain number of technologies I've marked as limitless in terms of the harm that they can cause, basically unlimited harm potential. One of those is nuclear technology. If you look at what happens to aging nuclear power plants that are built along the coastlines, they're just basically being babied along way past the point at which they should have been shut down and dismantled. And all of the spent nuclear fuel is stored generally on site because there's no place else to put it. So one of the things we should look forward to as glacial melt accelerates and there's seismic rebound in the Earth's crust under where the glaciers used to be is a meltwater pulse. And that's where ocean levels go up by tens of feet in a fortnight.
Oh, jeez.
And that will submerge all of these nuclear installations that are chock full of spent nuclear fuel, which has to be cooled. And that requires electricity for the circulation pumps and maintenance personnel on site to replace whatever breaks. If the nuclear reactor isn't supplying the electricity and the grid is down, because of all the nuclear reactors being underwater, then the only thing that can supply electricity to these installations is diesel. And if diesel can't be delivered, then they melt down. Usually there are hydrogen explosions when those pools run dry. The zirconium cladding of the spent fuel rods heats up and catches on fire. And then you have plumes of radioactive discharge covering large swaths of the planet, rendering all of the downwind areas unlivable for many generations.
How far downwind?
It's very hard to determine how bad things could get, but this is a gradual effect. Some people will die within weeks of radiation poisoning. Then radiation contamination will make it impossible for large-bodied organisms to reproduce successfully. They won't survive until adulthood, so they won't be able to breed. So in that sense, because of the large number of birth defects and miscarriages and things like that, it will make it impossible for humanity to perpetuate itself in the downwind areas. So that's the threat from nuclear technology. That's just one of them. Another one is, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which I don't know how many people know this, but a GMO diet, a diet of genetically modified soy and corn, causes sterility in rats in 3 generations.
Do you know who conducted those experiments?
Yes, some Russian scientists who are untainted with association with Western grants or Western scientific establishment.
Beautiful. So that's consistent with what we know of just low-quality diets overall, is a reduction in the ability to reproduce in about 7 generations.
Well, it goes beyond that. As you know, GMO technology is basically sort of like taking a cannon and shooting genes at a genome of an organism, and you don't know where it's going to land, where you're going to insert your chunk, and you hope that it lands in a place where the genes that you're blasting in there will get expressed. You don't know what you're knocking out in the process. We still don't know what genes do to a very large extent. All of that is just very murky as far as the science. Living cells produce a huge number of organic molecules, compounds, and we don't know what any of them do and whether they're necessary or not, what they're necessary for. The entire mentality of treating the whole thing as a bunch of different functions may be flawed altogether. And the scientists have a peephole view of it. So they basically have markers that they insert into the genome. Those markers aren't helpful either. It's just basically technological junk. But those genes are genes that convey resistance to antibiotics, because then you can test whether it took or not, whether the modification was effective or not. Not very helpful to have antibiotic resistance just kind of floating around your body, and all those genes can get swapped into bacteria in your gut. So now you have antibiotic resistant bacteria in your gut. It just goes on and on like that. It's awful. The more I learn about it, the more I realize what an awful thing it is.
And that those Russian sources of research are referenced in your book?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a concerted effort to suppress that study. That was successful. The effort was successful in the West. It was not successful in Russia itself. Russia has banned GMOs. It is now illegal to grow genetically modified crops in Russia. And the next step is to block import of GMO products, and that's ongoing. Next step after that is to block all food imports from GMO-contaminated nations, because that's the only way to really, deal with the problem. And that's a very difficult thing. But Russia stands a good chance of becoming 100% self-sufficient in food and making sure that all of that food is properly organic, that is, not modified genetically using these techniques.
Okay, so it's hard for me as an American to think of the Russian government looking out for the health and welfare of its citizens, but that
it's extremely effective in doing that.
Okay.
Much more so than the U.S. So, for example, an uninsured person gets beat up in Russia, goes to the emergency room, spends a week convalescing, gets a bunch of stitches put in, X-rays, painkillers, 3 meals a day, free Wi-Fi, gets discharged a week later. What's the bill?
I don't know.
What's the full out-of-pocket expense for that person? Well, make a guess.
Well, based on the fact that I think I spent 4 hours in the ER last month and it was $3,000, I would hate to guess what his bill could be in the U.S. Well,
yeah, in the U.S. it would be tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
In Russia, it's $250.
Wow.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems in Russia, but a government that is unresponsive to the needs of the people is not one of them.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. So nanotechnology.
Nanotechnology is a curious one because you don't know where it is. For instance, I bought some latex paint a while ago and painted with it and then realized that nothing will stick to it. Not any kind of tape. Most adhesives don't work with it. You just basically can't use most kinds of glues with it. It's really interesting. Well, what they did was they came up with some nanoparticles and they added them to the paint, and those nanoparticles render the paint non-adhesive. And the reason I know is that I know that this has been under development for quite some time, but nanotechnology has been added to all sorts of things, including containers for baby food and things like that. And we just don't know where it is. It's not labeled. It's treated as proprietary know-how, so you aren't even supposed to know where it is or what it is. And the problem is that everything eventually breaks down to the nanoparticles themselves. Eventually, this paint, one way or another, through fire or some other means or just erosion, will enter the biosphere as particles, and those particles will be ingested. They will probably pass through the blood-brain barrier, and who knows what they'll do to our brains. Nobody has done those tests, so that it's the harm potential of nanotechnology is infinite.
When did we abandon the precautionary principle?
Well, the way I see it is it's not we. We didn't have anything to do with it. The Technosphere has a bunch of principles that it adheres to. One of them is that the future is heavily discounted. The further in the future something is, the more heavily it is discounted. So everything is treated as present time cost. Okay. Nothing is regarded as harm. Everything is regarded as cost. If you cause harm, then you have to maybe pony up some money if you get sued. That's about as bad as it gets. But if you do something today that results in everybody dying a century from now, that's just completely irrelevant to the Technosphere. And no matter what we say about it, nothing will happen.
Okay. And I believe in your book you mentioned that the Technosphere has a war against clans and tribes. No?
Well, yes. The Technosphere promotes individual rights very heavily.
Okay.
And tries to break down any sort of group of people that is sufficiently cohesive to stand up to it. There are some groups that it has a lot of trouble with, that it's practically, given up on because, again, it applies cost-benefit analysis to everything. So the Amish, for instance, are pretty much immune to the technosphere. They don't pose enough of a threat on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cost of basically atomizing them and forcing them to ignore their group prerogatives and follow their individual prerogatives is just too great. So, the technosphere has backed off. There are some instances where you can make the technosphere back off, and that's what I talk about in the book to a great extent. So, yes. Yeah, go ahead.
So, is it true that you live on a houseboat off the coast of South Carolina?
Well, it's in a marina, and it's not a houseboat, it's a sailboat.
Okay.
I'm working on a project which is more of a houseboat, still a sailboat, but more of a houseboat. I hope to build one later this year.
But you're living in an actual sailboat now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because somewhere else I saw a description of you living in that tiny house movement, a tiny house built on a tiny boat that's infinitely portable. And that's not true.
Well, no, I've never. Well, the tiny house movement, is very cute. It's a wonderful, whimsical existence. But the problem with tiny houses is that they're on land, and land means zoning, and zoning means you can't possibly do what is sensible. You're forced to do what increases property values for the surrounding community. So you can put your tiny house in the middle of a bunch of farmland, but then why not put up a barn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And if you want to live in a tiny space, well, why don't you spend a couple of $1,000s and frame up a structure within that barn that's an apartment?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe use the barn to actually produce meat and milk and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds smart. And yourself currently, are you gardening?
Well, no, I don't really have time. I have gardened in the past. Our family in Russia has lots of land and a house in the country, so I may end up there. And if I do end up there, I'll be growing all kinds of things.
Oh, great! And you've written several other books. Ones that I know about are Reinventing Collapse and The 5 Stages of Collapse, a book of essays, and then with your background in linguistics, I assume you've written a number of books on English and how to learn languages.
Well, yes, I had a project. It still exists. It's just basically in hiatus because there was no marketing push behind it, and I'm too busy with other stuff. But basically, I came up with an alternative system for writing down English that doesn't have any of the quirks of English spelling, and that can be learned pretty much in a couple of weeks by anyone who speaks English. So that could be a giant breakthrough for English language literacy. It's just that introducing a system like that runs into all of the vested interests. Basically, people who don't know how to read and write English don't really have any ability to influence their fate as far as learning how to read and write English goes. And those who do know how to read and write English have basically a vested interest in preserving the system that serves them. And there are a lot of, there's a huge amount of inertia, social inertia that a system like this has to somehow work against. So the project really hasn't gone anywhere, but it's there. There's a pile of unspelled books that you can, it's called Unspell. There's a pile of unspelled books that you can order, including the Bible, including Alice in Wonderland, and lots of other children's books. So there's an entire children's library where you can take a kid, take a couple of weeks to teach them the alternative phonetic alphabet that the system uses, and then that kid will be off reading.
Nice. And so what's behind the Collapse books?
Well, what's behind it was initially, a realization. I watched the collapse unfold in the Soviet Union, and from '89 till about '94, '5. And at that point, I realized that, well, what happened in the USSR is going to happen in the USA, that it's basically the same trajectory, but delayed by some number of years or decades. And then the other thing that I realized is that the Soviet Union was inadvertently very collapse ready. It was a system that had a lot of resilience built into it in a great number of ways, which allowed the people in Russia and the other Soviet republics to survive collapse without catastrophic damage. And even when commerce was at a standstill and the political system was paralyzed or infested by foreigners trying to dismantle it, Russian society in particular did not collapse. It kept going, and eventually things came back, and a lot was lost, but a lot was restored. And I realized that the United States does not have any of those advantages. It's a completely fragile, just-in-time system with absolutely no margin of error. And when collapse comes here, basically the results will be far more devastating than they were in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I see all of the supports are methodically removed from the culture. Even the strange things of not having local warehousing anymore, that everything is trucked in a 24-hour period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all based on maximum fragility and interdependence.
Mm. So you're not a fan of electric cars, or you're not optimistic about electric cars solving any problems?
Oh, no, I think go-karts are great.
Well,
yeah, go-karts are good, and golf carts, I like those.
Oh, I thought you'd outgrown those.
Well, kids like them, so let's keep them around. But golf carts are, perfect for most, local transportation needs. As far as maintaining the highway system with electric cars, there are a few problems with those. First of all, it doesn't really work with lead-acid batteries, which is all the technology that can be produced in large enough quantity. Lithium batteries won't work because there isn't enough lithium.
So is that what Faraday's batteries are?
No, lithium is lithium-ion batteries. That's what people use in laptops and cell phones and Teslas.
And they're using that in Tesla, and then the Faraday's one of the competing cars coming up with a really powerful battery. I don't know. I guess it is lithium. I just didn't know. It's
lithium.
Okay.
Battery technology is basically bound by the laws of chemistry, and those are not likely to change. So research into batteries is a dead-end thing. Yeah, you can do all kinds of fancy things. That just drives up cost. So it's not going to scale up. The other thing is that if you don't have the oil business running full steam, you're not going to have paved roads. So what? You're going to have Teslas running on dirt roads? That's pretty ridiculous. And then the other thing is that people have to buy gasoline. Gasoline is industrially useless. So unless you have lots of little engines that can burn gasoline, it has to be flared off at refineries, and that will drive up the price of the real industrial fuels, which are bunker fuel and jet fuel, and that will make the entire industrial framework untenable. So yeah, sure, have fun with electric cars and have fun blowing up the entire industrial system. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Wow. So there's no road surface replacement for asphalt?
There isn't.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you're rather unique in that you entertain the ideas of the Unabomber. You find him to be an acceptable philosopher. Have you finished reading his current book?
No, I couldn't get through it. I mean, it's a bit of a problem reading a book written by somebody who's spending life in prison and has an unlimited supply of legal pads and pens and time. He does not have the gift of brevity, and I don't have the gift of limitless time.
Okay. actually has 2 books out now. One, a collection of essays, and then I guess the Anti-Tech Revolution is the one that you've been reading.
It's been sitting there. I started reading it, and I sort of agree with most of it, but it's sort of like, come on, Ted, get to the point. I liked his manifesto a lot. I think that most of what he says in the manifesto makes a great deal of sense. I actually contradict him on a few points. I think that overall his method of publicity through murder is somewhat unsound. Effective though it is, because he's still being read. But I don't advocate killing people as a way of drawing attention to your cause.
Yeah, I can see that's a horrible part of the way that he approached his criticism of technology, but I too was really taken by his ideas in the manifesto. I've even heard that the published manifesto has been reworked by, I guess, the CIA, and isn't the same as if you have that original New York Times that was published in, but I don't know if that's true or not.
I don't know either.
And so I'm still confused about your strategies for survival. For example, you can go out to sea in your houseboat, but that would be you and your family. And you can homestead in Siberia, but that's 100-acre patches. And I guess it's wrong for me to not think there'd be much of a social life there, because this probably won't be much different than 19th century America. But at the same time, you are very respectful of the power of community, and I'm just wondering where those things settle.
Well, they don't. I mean, it's all very much in flux, and I suppose it has to be that way. Eventually, I'll make some sort of choice. The way it's looking now is, I'll go back to Russia and do a bit of farming, and that's fine with me.
What crops does your family grow?
Whatever we eat. Actually, it's not farming, it's homesteading.
Oh, okay.
Farming is the wrong term. Farming implies that you're getting some sort of commercial advantage from actually selling what you grow. Homesteading is where you gain commercial advantage from not having to pay for your food.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. You're just so great with the language. You have spoken about the tragedy of Fukushima. Have you been tracking how far the contamination has gone from there?
Well, it's hard to track because the contamination, the radionuclides, are concentrated in living organisms. So tracking ocean currents is one thing, but tracking where it ends up by virtue of migratory marine species carrying it around is another. I think that there's going to be a wave of extinction as marine organisms fail to thrive.
Okay. I've seen such contradictory information, that the radiation is washing ashore in San Diego, and there's never any further confirmation about that. And, I guess I haven't heard anything much in the last few months, but I'm always exposed to alternative sources of information, but that's often the leading edge of fake news.
Well, eventually it'll settle out. The ocean is pretty big, and once the contamination sinks below the abyssal zone, we'll never hear from it again. Mm-hmm. So the ocean does have the ability to just make this stuff go away. The question is how much of it will make it ashore in the meantime in the form of seafood and things washing up on shore.
So how do you feel about artificial intelligence?
That is probably one of the most straightforward ways to see how the technosphere is controlling us as opposed to us controlling it. So, for instance, there's artificial intelligence now in the algorithms behind various dating sites. And so it's artificial intelligence that's breeding humans now, deciding who is going to be bred with whom. That's an interesting development. So basically, thanks to artificial intelligence, we're now really no different from farm animals. We're being bred by machines. So that's one example of where artificial intelligence plays a big part. Another is behavior control, because now we know that there are algorithms that will determine whether we pose a risk based on what we say before we even before it even occurs to us to try to commit a crime. So in the near future, we'll be neutralized based on some number of criteria determined by an algorithm, even before we decide to do anything that the system would perhaps dislike.
Well, that's swell. And other than leading and feeding humans, do you think it represents any further threat, any greater threat?
Well, yes, because what do you mean by human? There's a difference between a free-range human and a factory-farmed human. And what we have now mostly are factory-farmed humans. There's also a degeneration in what it means to be a normal human. The Technosphere doesn't really like the term normal. What it likes is for everybody to be a medical patient, because, patients are patient. They're easy to control. They never wander out of sight because they want the next dose of whatever drug keeps them alive. And so that makes them very subservient to the Technosphere. They stand no chance of gaining independence. And so that is something that is being aggressively pursued. People are put on regimens of drugs instead of having their ailments dealt with and actually resolved. And so that's the trend. And then, of course, there's all this promotion of degeneracy. Basically, we're now forced to accept what in the past would have been considered a lesser form of humanity, people who can't function at 100%. But we still have to accommodate them, be it with wheelchairs or with some other gizmo that allows them to participate. So all of those things are basically erosions of what it means to be human.
You've spoken probably on Kunstler's show about how the system is set up to create and promote psychopaths. Mm-hmm. Would you mind explaining that?
Oh, yes. Well, the Technosphere, it doesn't have certain qualities that we consider requirements for being human. One of them is compassion and the use of subjective judgment. It wants people to be basically rule-following automatons. If somebody within a bureaucratic setting starts manifesting compassion and starts breaking rules in order to do what they consider the right thing within a given situation, rules be damned, then they're immediately accused of being unprofessional. And that is a very difficult thing for normal humans to do, with one exception: psychopaths. Psychopaths are humans that don't have any compassion to begin with. They really don't have a sense of we, they just have a sense of I. And they don't feel much of anything, so to make themselves feel anything at all, they like to torture people. And so psychopaths do really well within bureaucratic settings, within corporations, within higher echelons of government. And so the more bureaucratized the society becomes, the more the Technosphere takes over, the more psychopaths there are. It's sort of a selective breeding experiment in promoting psychopathy, because psychopaths, they get to hold executive positions, so they can afford to have children and have nannies bring them up, which doesn't matter because they're probably psychopaths too. Psychopathy is 50% inherited. Yeah. So after a few generations of this, you're just full up with psychopaths. And it takes a few generations again for the psychopaths to sort of get themselves out of the gene pool, winnow themselves out of the gene pool. But that's been happening for a long time here in the U.S. And so if you look at government agencies, if you look at corporations, all of the higher echelons of those are just stocked with psychopaths. And then there's a different thing that happens with the lower echelon people. They suffer a huge amount of psychological damage by having to blindly follow rules. And they become something that I think it was Jablonski called them robopaths. Basically, they're people whose sense of self, whose identity has been tied into blindly following rules. They derive their sense of self by basically saying that the rules are the rules, and by being ruthless enforcers of those rules. So basically the C-suites are stocked with high-performing psychopaths, and then at the lower levels where the enforcers and the clerks, the frontline people are, that's stocked with knuckle-dragging robopaths who will, hurt you by imposing rules on you as ruthlessly and scrupulously as possible.
And yet they're not psychopaths.
They're not psychopaths. They're actually schizophrenics. If they're deprived of their ability to follow rules, what they end up with is schizophrenia.
Wow. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you keep your mind so sharp. And I always drift towards diet having a lot to do with that, past heredity. But do you have special interest in what you eat? I guess you said you don't.
I don't go out to eat. I hate restaurant food. To me, the United States is a food desert where you might get something edible once in a while if you really look for it, but it's very, very hard. I never buy anything prepackaged. I cook everything from scratch, and I do my best to just stick to very basic organic ingredients. And some things are really tough. Like how do you get wheat in the United States? It's all dosed with glyphosate.
Yeah, and GMOs. You mentioned some point there was a decline in humans as they moved from eating wild meat to eating farmed grain, and I just wondered if you were doing a paleo-type diet. Apparently not.
No, I basically eat what we've always eaten. But I cook everything from scratch, and I try to be very careful by reading the list of ingredients and just not trying to eliminate as many chemicals as possible from our diet.
Yeah, and how about coffee?
I don't touch coffee.
Okay, but you're a tea man.
Yes, I buy green tea in bulk from China.
Beautiful. And what are you working on now? Are you working on another book?
Well, right now I'm promoting the book that I've already written, and right now I'm not planning to write another book. I want to see how far this one gets. And whatever time I have, I'm doing two things. I'm running a tiny publishing house, so now I'm working on a couple of books. One is a translation from French on dealing with various types of accidents, nuclear, biological, radiological, chemical. It's written by Piero San Giorgio and a co-author of his. It's a fat volume with lots of scientific information, but rendered accessible to the average person. And I'm slowly but surely translating it from French. And then I'm working on another book on prosperous homesteading, which is, there are a lot of books on homesteading with pretty pictures. This one has not so pretty pictures, but it explains exactly what you have to do to make homesteading work economically. So it's a good book in terms of that, and I'm editing it right now. And other than that, I'm just working on designing the boat, the houseboat that sails, getting ready to build it, promoting it. We're going to try to crowdsource it as much as possible.
And do you still have a blog up that's covering the developments of the sailboat?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's quidnon.blogspot.com.
Okay. And what personal technologies do you embrace and actually use in your daily life? I mean,
well, I live on a sailboat, so everything on the sailboat has to work, and I have to embrace those technologies whether I want to or not. I didn't pick them because it's a commercially produced boat, but it's 35 years old or so. So it's a mishmash of old and new, and I just keep the whole thing working. So there isn't really much of a choice there. It's whatever fits and whatever works.
But you carry a smartphone.
I do.
Yeah. Do you have the Mac Watch, the iWatch?
No. I generally go for the cheapest thing that does the job.
And do you think the internet is more our enemy than our friend?
It's both. Yeah, it all depends on how you use it. So if you spend hours on Facebook, the internet is definitely your enemy.
Well,
if you use the internet to correspond with people around the world via email, personal messages, then it's your friend.
You've also spoken about the perpetual infantilization of human beings, particularly in the U.S., but also worldwide. Would you mind speaking about that for a moment?
Yeah, well, I grew up basically roaming the countryside by myself. If that happened in the United States, my parents would be accused of child neglect.
Well, not in my lifespan, but probably in your lifespan, yes. So I was born in 47, and believe me, if you were gone all day, that was just great.
Well, yeah, exactly. Show up for the meal.
Yeah.
That's what parents wanted in my day. It's like not to be seen or heard except when you're hungry.
Yeah. Okay.
So I grew up knowing all kinds of things. Like, I don't know, if you need to kill an animal and you don't have anything sharp on you, what do? Well, there's a way to make a sharp stick without using any sharp objects. You light a fire and you burn the tip of the stick, and then you drill it into the dirt, and you get a sharp stick. I mean, how many kids these days know a trick like that?
I work with a lot of kids. I'm an organic farmer, and I bring in a lot of interns that are, say, 18 years old, and they don't even know the principles of leverage. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fun getting kids into understanding boats. So that, first of all, teaching them knots is like a very interesting way to assess their mechanical intelligence. And some of them don't have any. That's the weird thing. Some kids don't have any mechanical intelligence because all they've done all their lives is push buttons. And when they can't achieve something by pushing buttons, they get upset.
Okay. So, let's see, I believe the current post on your blog talks about various scams that are being foisted upon people, rackets. I believe that's where you said that even the Defense Department was a racket.
Oh yeah, I mentioned that. There's a lot of rackets. Yeah, James Kunstler likes to use the term rackets. I guess I got that from him. I like to call them political machines. Basically, they're ways that the technosphere uses to get people to behave politically like laboratory animals. So they respond to certain stimuli that cause them to pull certain levers inside a voting machine, just like a rat pushes a lever to get a pellet of food. And these political machines basically span the entire political landscape of the U.S. So people are convinced of all sorts of absolutely faulty notions when it comes to medicine, when it comes to education, when it comes to the living arrangement, when it comes to transportation. So people, for instance, are convinced that the personal automobile is the hallmark of independence, as if being stuck in traffic most of your life makes you independent. And they don't realize that this is all a ploy to make them pay for gasoline. They don't realize that cars are basically just there to burn gasoline and to force people to pay for it, because otherwise the entire oil business becomes even less profitable. It's already unprofitable.
Yeah. But you subscribe to oil collapse also, don't you?
Well, it's ongoing. I mean, at some point, I think it was in the 1990s, the trend started as, younger people can't afford to buy cars anymore.
Okay.
A lot of them just don't drive. That's been a trend for a long time. So what's the solution? The solution is to sell SUVs to the people who can still afford to drive, because the SUVs burn more gasoline. problem solved. And if you really think about why things happen, like what's the most obvious reason, a lot of things become obvious. So people think that, a personal automobile is, the hallmark of freedom. Well, no. It's just a way of making people pay for disposing of toxic waste.
Yeah, so is municipal water.
Well, yes, yeah.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Dmitry. You mind giving your contact information, your blog site, and anything else you want to share? I'll also put those in the show notes.
Oh, sure. The blog is Club Orlov, cluborlov.blogspot.com. And that's where I publish something every Tuesday.
Okay. And what other blogs are you're active also on a peak oil site or an energy site?
Not really,
Okay.
no. A lot of other a lot of other websites pick up what I publish and republish it, depending on what the subject matter is. But I'm not really in control of any of that to any great extent.
Okay. Then we'll list that contact on the show notes. And I sure appreciate you taking the time and the patience to talk to us about your newest book.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's been great.
Just a reminder that you've been listening to the BD Now podcast. If you appreciate hearing programs like this, please take the time to leave positive feedback at iTunes or on the BD Now podcast page at bdnow.org. Also, information contained in this podcast, links can be found to it through bdnow.org at the show notes. Thanks again for listening. Bye.